Let me introduce our panelists. Dennis Horek, he is the former Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, Yemen, and former head of mission in Iran. Amir Hossein Barmaki, he is the current head of United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Iran and a humanitarian expert in the Middle East. Please note that Amir Hossein is only here for a personal visit and his views do not reflect UN position on any issues. Peggy Mason, she is the president of Rideau Institute and former Canadian ambassador to the UN for Disarmament. And Bijan Ahmadi, he is the executive director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and former president of Iranian Canadian Congress. Without any further ado, let's start our briefing session on Canada's role in the Middle East and its Iran policy. The Middle East has been quite challenging for Canada in the past few years, from failing to restore diplomatic relations with Iran to having its ambassador expelled from Saudi Arabia over a tweet about human rights. This has left Canada with less influence and no warm relations with two major powers in the region. One of the main objectives of this panel is to comprehend what indeed is Canadian foreign policy in the Middle East, and more importantly, to further explore the opportunities that exist for Canada in that volatile region. With this, I would like to open the floor and ask Dennis this question. As a former Canadian ambassador, what is Canada's foreign policy in the Middle East? And give us a high-level picture of what Canada considers as its interest in the region.
Thank you very much. I have to say, just to start off with, I never thought I'd actually be saying this, but the past 2 weeks' weather in Ontario has made me pine for Saudi Arabia. That's something. You know, in looking at this, and I've been dealing with the Middle East off and on both at headquarters and abroad for over 20 years, or I did before I retired. And, you know, I think if you ask most Canadians about the Middle East and talk to them about it, and I've had Canadians say this, I mean, it comes up every now and then in the press, is if you ask them, I think most Canadians would say, why are we bothering? Why do we care? It's far away, it's complicated, there's always a problem. It's got nothing to do with us, so let's just keep out of it. And I think from time to time governments kind of feel that way as well. Canadian governments do. In my experience, no Canadian government has ever made the Middle East a foreign policy priority. Typically, you know, you get priorities that are set up for the U.S., for China, India, Latin America, whatever flavor of the particular era happens to be. This is going to be the government's initiative or the government's priority. It's never the Middle East. The problem is the Middle East has a nasty habit of coming up and biting you. With modern communications and transportation the way it is, globalized economy, the Middle East just won't go away. We can't escape the Middle East any more than we can escape the world. And that means we have core interests that are at play in the region, whether we like it or not. There are risks we have to mitigate or contribute to mitigating, and there are opportunities we should be able to exploit. The interests that we have are wide-ranging, and they should transcend individual government priorities or fascinations. Essentially, there are four baskets, if you will. Security and stability, values agenda, and by that I mean democracy, governance, human rights, that sort of basket of issues. We have commercial interests, and we have consular interests, which I think is something that a lot of people tend to neglect in terms of what are our interests. Ideally, these interests should align with the government's priorities, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And it depends on the particular interests of any particular government. Harper government, for example, gave the Middle East a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and despite what sort of the conventional wisdom, it was more than to do with Israel. Others, like the current government, have little interest in the Middle East, or if they do, it's very narrowly focused. But whatever their interests, their priorities, inevitably Canada gets dragged into something, or the world gets dragged into something, because the Middle East is not a quiet area, as we know. I'll start off a little bit with the strategic security interests that we have. Canada, like the rest of the world, has an interest in regional stability and security in the Middle East. It's unavoidable. As I said, some Canadians may feel this is kind of odd. What do we care? But we need to. The current government kind of gets it, and the priorities that they have laid out for the Middle East do kind of reflect this. There is a reference, for example, to combating terrorism, violent extremism, WMD issues, so that is part of the priorities. And we have taken some positive steps, or we, government, sorry, if I'll say we, sometimes it's just habit. We have undertaken some positive steps in engaging key regional partners on this issue. For example, committing resources to Syria and Iraq, for example, or some of the dialogue that we have with countries on terrorism issues. We have dialogues on counterterrorism, things like that. But I think the impacts of threats to Middle East security and stability are broader, even if they may be more indirect to Canada. War and stability in the region has wider implications, and they're not confined to the Middle East. Refugees, for example, we saw this with the war in Syria. That had broad implications. I mean, Europe was just, the refugee inflows in Europe had a really important impact, and it's still reverberating today. And it's had an impact on their politics, and on the politics of particularly in Eastern Europe, and the reaction to the refugee inflows and the changing demographics of some of the countries. And obviously a regional war or instability in Saudi Arabia or Iran, for example, could threaten global oil supplies. And this has major implications for Canada. It's not that Canada or the US are dependent on Middle Eastern oil, on Gulf oil. We're not. I mean, we import some, but we could find alternative supplies. That's not the issue. The issue is that most of our key trading partners are dependent on safe, stable supplies of Middle East oil. Were they to be cut off or somehow impeded because of a war or instability in Iran or Saudi Arabia, that would reverberate across the world, and that would have an impact on Canada. So we absolutely have an interest. But advancing those interests involves more than just dialogue in cooperation on a narrow set of issues like counterterrorism, for example. We need to engage across the board. Security is a comprehensive issue, but we need wide-ranging responses to it. This involves not only the specific dialogue on security and things like that on ISIS or whatever, or on Iran that we already engage in, but it involves as well supporting reform efforts in places like Saudi Arabia, in trying to encourage, and elsewhere, trying to encourage sort of the best angels that are out there to try and deal with governance issues, deal with education, that sort of thing. That's all part of the security basket, I think. We need to engage them diplomatically, culturally, commercially, politically, all across the board. That's all part of the security umbrella, I think. If we don't do it, if Canada doesn't do it, if Western countries don't do it, others will. China will, Russia will. And I don't think their interests align too closely with ours. And I think that's something I don't think that's widely recognized. The current government, Trudeau government, is focused, I don't want to say exclusively, but almost, on the values agenda, which is a core interest, and there's value in that, and it's important. As I said, that is linked to security. All of those issues about democratization, about governance issues, about human rights, they all have a security dimension to them, so they are important, and they're important in their own right in terms of Canada pursuing them and advancing them, because it's who we are. It reflects Canada's principles, and I think that's important. But I think in some respects, I think our emphasis on this values agenda is lopsided. I think it's overly focused on that aspect. And you can see that if you look at the list of priorities that are on the department's website, on the Global Affairs Canada, sorry, I can't get my head around that still. Global Affairs Canada website. 5 of the 7 priorities listed are you could directly put them into that values agenda basket. And to me, as I said, I think that's a bit lopsided. I mean, you have democracy, human rights, alleviate suffering, food security, women, children, opportunities, things like that. Even the trade priority, which talks about advancing bilateral trade, two-way trade between Canada and the region, has an economic reform aspect. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think it's unbalanced. The values agenda shouldn't be pursued in isolation or too narrowly defined. If we are solely talking about human rights, whether it's Iran, whether it's Saudi Arabia, or whatever, Egypt. It conveys our principles. I agree with that. It doesn't advance those issues, I think, in any way. It becomes too focused on we're telling them what to do, and it gets us ignored. We have to have a broader relationship. And if we're so focused on one particular issue, we end up then putting obstacles in the way of the advancement of other issues, and it's about missed opportunities. If we care about anything, doing anything to advance these issues, we have to have a broader engagement across the board.
Indeed, like this is one of actually the questions that we're going to talk about. What would be like the most effective way to address human rights? But before that, since you talked about the foreign policy priorities for Canada, we know that one of them is nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And I wanted to turn this to Peggy, since you're an expert in this area, and ask you, what is Canada's policy for nuclear non-proliferation in the Middle East, and what are the dangers that we face in terms of proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East? Has Canada played any role in advancing that interest?
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. And of course, like the Dennis's question, this is a huge one, and people who know me will be very afraid if I really launched into it. So I'll try and focus. I mean, I think we can't talk about what our role is in the region with respect to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament until I have to say a few things about what our policy is. Because, I mean, essentially, in a nutshell, we don't really have a region-specific focus on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, except, in a few cases. We have a broader agenda, and if you go to the website, you will see that the cornerstone, that's the term used, and this is long-standing language, of Canada's nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament policy is the NPT, the Treaty on Nuclear Non-Proliferation. And that treaty, and it's very useful to recall this, was essentially a three-pronged bargain. The vast majority of states who didn't have nuclear weapons would agree never to acquire them. The small number that had them, and at this point we have within the NPT structure 5 so-called declared nuclear weapon states, they would agree to engage in good faith negotiations towards the objective of nuclear disarmament. In other words, the treaty, I know, it's hard to say this with a straight face given what's going on now, but under the treaty, it was not meant to give the nuclear weapon states a right to nuclear weapons in perpetuity. And actually, there's actually been an interpretation by the International Court of Justice of the disarmament provision, Article 6, and the obligation is to pursue good faith negotiations towards the ultimate objective of nuclear disarmament. And then the third aspect of the bargain was the facilitation of peaceful nuclear cooperation, so that those countries, the vast majority, there's 190 states parties now, only 5 of whom are nuclear weapon states, the vast majority were giving up the right to nuclear weapons in perpetuity, but they were not giving up the right to peaceful nuclear cooperation. So that's that is the sort of preeminent treaty that Canada promotes, and there's a review process every 5 years that we generally play quite a strong role in. But I would say, and this is very true and relevant to the region we're talking about, the focus certainly in the last number of years has been much more on the non-proliferation side, in other words, preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to new countries, rather than on getting the nuclear weapon states to seriously engage in disarmament negotiations. I'm not saying we don't have initiatives along that line, but they pale in comparison to the efforts that are made on the nuclear non-proliferation side. Now, relevant to the region, of course, all states in the region, in the Middle East, except Israel, are states parties, are non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT. All have international safeguards, because that's the other thing that people don't realize. I mean, there's a vast, very robust system of international safeguards administered by the International Atomic Energy Agency to ensure that all these countries that are engaged in peaceful nuclear energy-related matters and cooperation are not diverting any of that nuclear material to non-peaceful purposes. So, all of the states in the region except Israel are non-nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT. Israel has nuclear weapons and is not a member of the NPT. It's not a declared nuclear weapon states that, they haven't, they maintain ambiguity, but, it's a fact. They are a nuclear weapon state. Interestingly, Israel does have safeguards on its peaceful nuclear activities. It's there in light of cheating in the past with respect to Iraq. There was a negotiation which led to an additional protocol to the international safeguard system, which significantly increases the IAEA's ability to verify the peaceful use of nuclear weapons in states that have such agreements. And it's interesting, there are a number of states in the region that actually are party to the additional protocol, not all, but some. Just to emphasize how effective this system is in detecting diversions of nuclear material from peaceful purposes, the IAEA was the first to detect North Korean diversions from peaceful purposes. So there really is a robust international system. There are some issues with the treaty and what it covers, and notably, this is very relevant with respect to the case of Iran, for example. The treaty does not. There are certain activities that actually are key to the process of becoming a nuclear weapon state, but they're not prohibited by the NPT because it focuses on the fissile material and not other activities, most notably uranium enrichment. And the problem there is it's not prohibited by the NPT, and it is carried out by some NPT members in good standing, like Japan, for peaceful purposes, but it is a key enabler for nuclear weapons production, which means that when there's a concern that a country might be seeking nuclear weapons, might be moving from its, might be contravening its status as a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT, if it's engaging in enrichment, uranium enrichment activity. But as I say, this is complicated because it's not outright prohibited, and there are countries that are legitimately doing this. So the other relevant aspect of this, is that since at the end of the Cold War, when we were starting to really get rid of nuclear weapons, there was tremendous progress made with respect to the Soviet, then Russian, and American nuclear weapons arsenals. There was the first ever, there have been some since, first ever summit level meeting of the UN Security Council, and they declared that proliferation of nuclear weapons is a threat to international peace and security. So that's actually the basis for the UN Security Council to take action. That means the spread of nuclear weapons is the threat, not the fact that the ones that already have it are gaining more, which of course is the situation that we're faced with now. So, I'll just...
I just want to focus more on the Middle Eastern.
Yeah, okay, but so that's, that's the background, because Canada is not. Okay, so Canada, that's the broad position, and the immediate problem that arises is that the only country in the region that actually has nuclear weapons is Israel, but you will look long and hard to find efforts by Canada to address that. On the other hand, with respect to the danger of nuclear concerns in the region, obviously, until the signing of the joint comprehensive program of action, i.e. the Iran nuclear deal, there was much concern, and Canada was among the concerned, the UN Security Council was among those concerned, about Iran's nuclear weapons program. But with the signing of that agreement, there is no...
Yeah, since you brought the case of Iran, I wanted to focus a little bit on that as well. Since U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the rest of countries involved in nuclear negotiation, the P4+1, have been trying to save the nuclear agreement with Iran. EU recently announced that they registered a special payment mechanism for Iran called INSTEX. But some say that China won't be successful in convincing businesses to work with Iran. Do you think P4+1 will be able to preserve the nuclear agreement with Iran? And what would be the consequences if Iran exit the deal for the international community? Bijan, you can.
So first, thanks a lot to all of you for coming out tonight to this event with this weather that we have. INSTEX, it took a while for Europe, right after Trump exited from the nuclear agreement. European Union announced that they're going to take measures to preserve and save the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. One of the major steps that Iran was very hopeful about as well was initiating and basically establishing special payment vehicle for Iran and Europe to be able to, and they were hopeful and they're still hopeful that other countries will join that special payment mechanism as well, so that this basically payment, this financial mechanism can circumvent U.S. sanctions and allow for lawful trade with Iran, between Iran and European businesses to happen. Now, what happened is that recently Europe announced that they have registered. It's not operational yet, and that's one of the problems. Sorry, I just actually turned on my microphone. So I hope that you all heard my voice. But recently, Europe announced that they registered, only registered, it's not operational yet, a mechanism called INSTEX. Now, in the initial stage, they have said that it's going to focus only on humanitarian trade with Iran. And that's one of the problems, because the nuclear deal, when P5+1 and Iran entered the nuclear agreement, the expectation, the offer and acceptance was that basically Iran will accept to put limits on its nuclear program and agree to inspections, more inspections than are basically in the NPT or the additional protocol. They're actually voluntarily implementing additional protocol as well. So in return for those limitations, they will get sanctions reliefs and businesses are going to be allowed to work with them. It was not, so Iran did not agree to the nuclear deal with this in background that they're not going to be allowed only to do humanitarian trade. They want to be able to basically do any trade that is lawful and practical for the Iranian needs. So that's one of the problems with this payment mechanism that has been established and registered right now. I believe, and many experts in Middle East also think, that if INSTEX is going to be for a broader scope, includes other trades as well, and if they can actually make it operational quickly, in comparison, it has taken now around, I think, since May that Trump exited JCPOA, it has took them all this time for Europe to establish this. And it's understandable because it's a complicated process. U.S. has major influence in the financial system in the world. It's the first time kind of that this is happening. But if they can broaden the scope, it will help Iran in some aspects. And I believe that Iran, because of that, and also to have the political support of European Union, they will stay in the deal. However, one thing, and I'll finish with this, one thing we need to note on this side as well, is that Iranians are, their concerns are growing right now. And if you look at the recent public opinion that was released, a public opinion that is very credible called Iran Poll. It's done in cooperation with University of Maryland. And recently you look at the numbers that they have released, a growing number of people inside Iran, they're losing hope and confidence in Europe's ability to save the nuclear deal. And it's the same thing in the leadership of Iran as well. They're losing hope in Europe. And with that, and with the maximum pressure campaign that Trump has started and is continuing, there is danger that if Europe is not successful, if other countries in P5+1 and countries, other responsible countries like Canada, they don't join, they don't show leadership on this, they may actually exit the deal if they cannot see that there is any benefit to it.
Yeah, I mean, there are two aspects to this, really. There is what the governments can do in terms of creating a context or a sort of financial infrastructure. and whether it's Instex or whether it's setting up sort of protections for trying to shield European companies from retaliation, as they did with Helms-Burton back in the day when it came to Cuba, that's one thing. The other thing is the behavior and the attitudes of companies themselves. And we saw this when I was there in 2009 to 2012, and sanctions were being upgraded both internationally and then bilaterally, Canada, other countries in terms of bilateral sanctions. But even before that, there were companies that legally they were permitted to do X, Y, and Z. Banks, for example, Canadian banks, that wanted no part of Iran, even though they were legally entitled to do it. They just felt the due diligence that would be required to sort of make sure they weren't violating this law or that law, either in Canada or the U.S. or whatever, and the benefits that accrued from that the risk-benefit just didn't play out. And I think this is going to be part of the problem as well, in trying to sort of provide the benefits that are implicit or explicit, really, in the whole nuclear agreement, that, you know, for this you get this. That's fine, but companies are the ones that need to deliver that. And I think for a lot of companies, in that small window we have when the JCPOA came into effect, and companies went in there, some companies had big deal, Boeing, for example. Others then started to realize, as we all know, the difficulties of doing business in Iran, the economic mismanagement, just the very difficult business environment, given the various vested interests that are there. And so again, if they're looking right now at the cost benefit of this, regardless of what sort of infrastructure that the EU or others set up, a lot of companies are just going to go, it's not worth it.
Can I just quickly throw in one tiny little point? There is an interesting other element. I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but there have been statements, I think the French in particular and others. I mean, given the willingness of the United States to impose secondary sanctions in furtherance of basically illegal sanctions under international law, and I mean that everybody, a lot of countries, a lot of allies are staring down the barrel of this. And so, and I think, as I said, I think it's the French that have actually voiced this. We all need more economic independence, more financial independence from the United States. So that side of the equation, that this isn't just something to help Iran, this is something that ultimately a lot of countries may have a stake in. And that, you know, again, with companies, how will that play? But it's just another factor.
But that's ultimately, it's going to be corporate decisions
Yeah.
that determine it.
And I want to get a little bit insight about the impact of sanctions on Iran from a humanitarian perspective, and we can elaborate a little bit on that.
Thanks a lot. Good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for all the trouble in this weather that we managed to get to here. Actually, was quite a tough
Congratulations.
process today to get here. Actually, although I mean, additional to that, I came from Tehran for a personal visit. But thanks a lot for the organizers actually having this very important, actually timely event on the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, actually 2 days ago, and then now ongoing Warsaw Conference about the Middle East security, which is again about Iran actually, and then also discussing these issues related to humanitarian matters. I think it's very important to have a clear idea of what we are discussing and how it could affect the Iranian people and also people in the region. I mean, I'm a friend of Canada. I mean, I lived in this country for a long time before, not anymore, but and I'm here on my personal capacity, not on the UN capacity at all. Whatever I say is not represent my organization, it's my personal view, but I think it was really important as an Iranian who doesn't live in this country and live in the middle of that problems that you are talking about it in this cold weather here, what the reality is on the ground and actually how it would affect the people actually on the ground. As an Iranian, I think that's very important that I pass that message with or without my organization's involvement. Is the sanctions itself had a tremendous negative effect on Iranian life and people. And not only Iranians actually. Before this crisis of that Dennis rightly mentioned about refugees actually going to Europe and including the Syrians, which we were having around, Iran was the number one actually, what people say two, but actually was number one host of refugees in the world, and still is. I mean, because the Syria issue will be solved hopefully soon, somehow some of them will repatriate, but the problem that we're facing with Afghan refugees are never going to be solved. It seems to be like that after 4 decades, and it's going to stay more and more. After Pakistan has registered all of them, so we have something around 3 million, 2.5 million actually, but because Iran doesn't register all of them as refugees, there's a difference of numbers here, who's number one, who's number two. Basically, Iran is hosting the most number of Afghan refugees anywhere in the world actually. I mean, the Syria crisis now is a kind of a distraction to the original problem of the Middle East. It would affect them also. And it would affect Canada actually. It was very interesting that Dennis raised that it's very important that Canadians think the Middle East is something obscure that nothing to do with us, it's better out of, No. It directly affects you because the number of Middle Easterns actually living in this country. Just look around, the number of countries have represented, the number of the population here, including Iran and Afghans. But they can actually push the Middle East into more problems. A lot of people were thinking of getting out. And this is something that it would be additional, I think would be very soon, it's already actually started, the influx of people moving from the Middle East, from Iran and Iraq, and actually Afghanistan mainly, to Europe, and would end up in Canada, some of them, and then they end up in the United States and other places actually. It's already happening, as we are discussing, because of the situation on the ground, because of the humanitarian impact of these illegal sanctions, as Iranian officials rightly actually, and the ICJ case recently was very clear indication of this is illegal actually, sanctions on the country. You might have problems with the country politically, with the government of the country, but I don't understand how the people of that state could be collateral damage actually, or receive the collateral damage, or be actually punished because of the system they are having. Interestingly, they also argue all the time that the system they have doesn't represent them. So then why you can't punish them for a system that you claim that doesn't represent them at all? This is interesting actually, point of view of looking into it. There are facts there. We have problems of accessing medicine now, especially in oncology, cancer-related medicine, which is imported mainly, non others mainly are produced inside Iran. But again, when I say produced inside Iran, maybe it's not better than you, but there, and both at the same time, 90% of Iranian pharmaceutical actually production in the country is imported from outside. So the raw materials come from outside and they're produced inside the country. So basically we are facing serious problems of lack of access to basic medical actually care. And then if you think something, actually, some people think a neighboring country actually here, that it would somehow affect the system to change behavior. No. That's because the people who have the money, who have the relations, who have the resources, if they want to have medical checkup, they come to Toronto or London, as recently was the case of a VIP actually person, very VIP actually, who went to London for a medical checkup actually. Check the news, you will find out what I'm talking about. So the people who are really are the ones to think they would be affected by this, it would not be affected by this. The general public would be affected by this, and is already affected by this issue. I could give more and more examples. I don't want to take the time off the panel on that because I think during Q&A we want to have more time. But I want to return back to what Dennis has said on the global affairs, State Department, whatever they now call it, the values. If this country is values, from the 7 of the values, the core issues that you read from the website, 5 of them are related to humanitarian issues and human rights. How this could be neglected completely by Canada, who thinks that is progressing values and humanitarian issues and human rights internationally, and let a country of 85 million people who has a considerable actual number of diaspora in your country to be completely sidelined and sanctioned directly to the issues that is directly impacting the life of normal, ordinary people in the streets, have nothing to do with the politics.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, one of the stated priorities of Canada in the region is promoting respect for human rights. But what is the most effective approach to address human rights in Middle Eastern countries? You were in Saudi Arabia, Iran, now many countries, so I think you would be the best person to start with. And then we can go around the table.
Well, I would say the least effective way to approach human rights is kind of the approach that we've taken, and not just with this particular government, but previous governments as well. But I think it's sort of increased under the current one. It's something that I call Twitter diplomacy, which I don't think is an effective way to deal with things. To stand on the sidelines and yell at countries and wag your finger at them, the natural reaction is to get your back up or to ignore. And I don't think that's effective. It can be part of building an international, if it's a particular issue, a particular case, it can be part of building an international consensus on a particular issue or a particular country. I get that. But it has to be part of a broader relationship. You have to be engaged. The formula is pretty simple. It's, if you engage a country, then you get access to, if you engage them across the board, political, diplomatic, commercial, what have you, you get access to senior people. And when you get access to senior people, you have an opportunity for influence. If you're standing on the sidelines and just screaming and yelling your finger, waving your finger, it gets you nowhere. I mean, we know this in our own human interactions. If you've got a neighbor who's annoying and is throwing his garbage at the end of your street, and you've never said a word to him except yell at him about the garbage, he's going to ignore you. But if you had established a relationship with him, and you were friendly with him, and you knew him, you talked to him, and say, hey Joe, listen, don't throw the garbage in the street. He may still tell you to get lost, but he may listen to you. And it's kind of the same thing. So I think you need to have a relationship that engages across the board so that you can talk and you can make your representations on a particular case or a particular issue. You still may get ignored. And most of the countries in the region will ignore us. But it does start to register, and then you start to try as well to try and use sort of soft power influences to try and change the narrative in the country. And for Saudi Arabia, for example, we had a very well developed education cooperation program. 15,000 students a year that would come here. And there's 100,000 students across the world that go to Western countries, Saudis. They go to Western countries. They go back as engines of change, as agents of change. And you see some of this reflected in some of the reforms in Saudi Arabia, and we'll get to that later, I know. But so it has to be a comprehensive approach. Standing and yelling, it's PR. To my mind, it's meant to sort of hit constituencies that a particular government wants, whether it's Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, or their own domestic constituencies, to say, look at us, aren't we moral? Well, that's fine. I mean, we can tick that box and get pats on the back when they go to Geneva. But in terms of actually, if what we want to do is change, actually effect change, and if our objective is that, as opposed to being seen to be good human rights people, then you need to engage and you need to have a comprehensive relationship.
Amir, I see you nodding your head if you want to add.
I mean, total agreement actually, because we basically, as for Canada, this is also how the UN is all about actually, and also all the same people. The Middle East situation of human rights is not good. I mean, whoever said we don't have human rights problems in the Middle East, I think it has to going to be checked. And the reports of UN are very clear there, what's going on. But the solution to it, beyond yelling at them, which is needed sometimes actually, is to engage. And if you're not engaging and talking exactly, how are you going to have an impact? How Canada could have an impact on the human rights situation in Iran without having an embassy there? How could this be possible? Without even talking to these people actually. I'm not saying embassy would be a miracle that's actually changed, but at least it would give you a channel of talking about the issues or to do some capacity building. And then it's not all about human rights. Human rights, I mean, the political side of it also been seen a lot of attention, but we have a lot of other subjects related to human rights, and health, access to health, access to education, access to job, access to employment, access to water, access to sustainable development, sustainable environment, which is climate change protection basically now. If you don't have these other sides of the human rights, and only some countries only focus on, this is not about Iran, it's all Saudi and all the countries in the region have the same issue. Iraq, Turkey now, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of them. If all the time we criticize them, we should be, because they deserve to be criticized on a number of issues they do. But one-sided array of criticism without really looking into other aspects of what other rights are that the people have been denied because of this political fight we have with them, they have to be considered, especially when it comes to humanitarian issues. Humanitarian issues for Canada, I think, is one of the most important international policy values that we really believe in. That at least we see Canada from outside. I don't know if inside the same belief or not.
Yeah. You brought up the issue of embassies in Iran, and I know, Bijan, you've been an advocate for re-engagement between Iran and Canada and restoring diplomatic relations. So give us an update, and is there any hope to re-establish diplomatic relations between Iran and Canada?
Before I actually talk about that,
Yeah.
on the issue of medicine, when I actually posted on my Twitter that I'm going to talk on this subject, a couple of civil society activists inside Iran messaged me and they told me, make sure you talk about the medicine and healthcare situation and the impact that the sanctions have had on this. And Mr. Barmaki talked about this. I want to just add a couple of points on that issue and then I'll get to Iran-Canada relations. United States has claimed that their sanctions, and if you ask them, your sanctions are impacting humanitarian issues, including medicine, access to healthcare, they say that we have exempted humanitarian trade with Iran. Well, that's not actually correct. If you look at this issue practically, in practice you see that, first of all, they have listed and designated a couple of major pharmaceutical companies. There is a major company inside Iran that provides radio pharmaceuticals inside Iran for diagnosis and treatment of cancer. That company, for example, is one of the ones that is actually listed directly in the sanctions list of the United States after Trump exited from the nuclear program. The other issue is that the banking situation. When you impose sanctions and SWIFT, for example, cut Iran from their system, then there is no way to actually do the financial transaction. There was a report recently in Guardian that European diplomats asked United States to provide clarifications, instructions, whitelist these humanitarian needs so that banks and companies, the suppliers, provide these needed raw materials or the actual medicine and healthcare equipment to Iran. Based on that report and what the EU diplomats said, U.S. refused to do that. So that's a major situation. And the other thing is when you have sanctions on Iran, the impact that it has on the economy. Since Trump exited from the JCPOA, the value of Iranian currency rial has dropped by over 50%. The impact that has on affordability of medicine and access to healthcare for people is a lot. The usual medicine that people used to purchase in the Iranian market right now is way more expensive, even if they can access that. So there is the shortage because of the sanctions, the medicine shortage, and so it's the access issue and also the affordability problem. And there is a good paper in Lancet Oncology journal that you can read about it. It was actually written by a doctor in the Toronto Sick Kids Hospital and a doctor inside Iran about the situation of healthcare and the impact of sanctions on this. On the issue of Iran-Canada relation, as far as I'm aware, the negotiations for re-engagement with Iran that started after election of Prime Minister Trudeau, that has not continued. There were a couple of rounds of negotiations. As you know, Prime Minister Trudeau, both before the election and after, he promised that he's going to re-engage with Iran and reestablish diplomatic relations. They had some rounds of negotiations, including negotiations between at the ministerial level on the sidelines of UN General Assembly. I want to tell you the barriers and the problems that exist from both sides, from the perspective of both sides, and I'll kind of mention them, and we can talk about it more in Q&A. So on the Canadian side, one of the most important problems is the consular cases that Canada has been dealing with in Iran. But the consular cases, I can sort of say a couple of them. The case of Dr. Homa Houtfar, I believe it was in 2016. She was released about 3 months after she was arrested and detained in Iran. And it was actually, she was released a week after former Minister Dion met with Javad Zarif in the UN, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And I believe that the negotiations that were happening at the time actually helped her case, and the Iranian Foreign Affairs Ministry was actually advocating for her release. Right now we have the case of Mr. Saeed Malikpour that has been going on for a while. He's a permanent resident of Canada, and the case of Ms. Maryam Mombaini, and the death of Professor Qaboos Amami that happened unfortunately last year in Iranian prison. But even if we look at this situation, and this is something that, don't believe me on this, believe both Minister Freeland and Minister Dion. They have said this, that because of consular cases, it was over before sort of a year ago, that we were saying that because of consular cases, we need to have a diplomatic channel with Iran. Because otherwise, there is no channel for Canada to advocate for resolution of these problems. The other problems that I want to talk about, so from the perspective, from the now kind of the Iranian perspective on the issue of re-engagement, there are two major points that I want to mention. One is the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act. Perhaps Mr. Horak can talk about this more, but it was a bill that was passed that took away with the amendments to the State Immunity Act, took away the state immunity of Iran and Syria, because for the first time, Harper government established a list of sponsors of terror, state sponsors of terror, and he put only Iran and Syria on that list. There were court orders against Iran based on those changes that the Harper government made to our laws. And the other, so this is one problem from the from the Iranian perspective. They want to be out of this list. And the second problem from Iranian perspective is there is, maybe you can call it a consular case. They have requested extradition of an Iranian former banker, Mahmoud Reza Khavari, who was being convicted in Iran for embezzlement. He fled to Canada right after his case was they were after him and they started an investigation. Not only the government of Iran has asked for his extradition, there's no extradition treaty between Iran and Canada. They have asked through Interpol. But also Iranian Canadians here have asked so many times during Harper time, during Trudeau time, either extradite him for him to face justice in Iran or at least open an investigation. Many Iranian Canadians say that if, as an Iranian here in Canada, you want to open a bank account with even a couple of $100s, many times you have to answer so many questions. And in 2012, hundreds of bank accounts on Iranians got closed for no reason other than they were only Iranians and the banks were afraid of sanctions. But Mr. Khavari perhaps brought millions of dollars into this country, so at least there could be some sort of investigation about him. But the Harper government never responded to these requests and answered these questions. The Trudeau government never answered that as well. So this is another concern. I'm hopeful that at some point in the future, we realize in Canada, the Canadian government realizes that it is within its interest, because of all the points that Mr. Horak and Ms. Mason mentioned, that it is within Canada's interest to have relations with all countries in the world, especially with a major power in the Middle East like Iran. We have interest in the Middle East. The case has been made. So we need to have relations, diplomatic relations with them to be able to advance Canada's interests.
Yeah, this is a really complicated issue. As everybody knows, the relations between Canada and Iran have been fraught almost from the advent of the Islamic Republic. You know, I'm not going to go through the history of it here. And there are barriers, and Bijan's absolutely right. I mean, the JVTA, the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, was in some ways the final straw. I mean, it was a barrier that was set up, and when it came out, when it was passed in March of 2012, I was there, and we have to remember the context of what was happening at that point in November of 2011. The British Embassy had been attacked, and it was quite brutal, the attack on it. Then we passed a piece of legislation in March that was going to take effect in September of 2012. The Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, which, just in case people don't know, allows anyone in the world, they don't have to be Canadian, to come to Canada to launch a court case against the Iranian government for suffering that they have endured as a result of Iranian-sponsored terrorism. What would happen then if there was a judgment that Iranian non-diplomatic properties in Canada, and they had some, could be seized and sold in order to pay those judgments. And I think there have been 8 cases subsequent to that. Now, when that passed, and given the context of what we'd seen with the British and Iran's, shall we say, flexible attitudes towards diplomatic immunity and protection, it became very difficult for us to be there under that context. So that's sort of what got the ball rolling about closing. And it's still there. The legislation is still there. Most of those properties, those non-diplomatic properties, have been seized and sold. So, you know, in theory, that's not a problem anymore until they come back and perhaps have new properties and new court cases. So this is a problem, and it's a piece of legislation that was supported across all party lines, so that is a problem. I'd like, though, to come to the issue of consular, because I hear this a lot, that by not being there, we're missing out on being able to adequately represent Canadians in Iran. It's one of those things that sounds good in theory, but the reality is very, very different. The vast majority of Canadians in Iran are dual nationals. And we had some Canadians there. Gas Michel was one back in the day. Others, Malakpour is not a Canadian, he's a permanent resident, but nonetheless. Anytime we tried to talk to the Iranians about Canadians in prison, they refused 100% to talk to us. So whether we're there or not there, the answer is still, they will not engage in consular discussions with Canada about dual nationals. It's hard enough to engage them in consular conversations about Canadians who are not dual nationals who get into trouble, because they're not very cooperative there either. But when it comes to dual nationals, there is no conversation to be had. So I don't think that's a really valid argument by why we need to be there. I mean, there are other services we can provide to Canadians there in terms of documentation and passports and all that sort of thing, and those are all important, to be sure. But, I mean, ideally you would want to be there. You'd want to have a dialogue on consular issues as and when they came up. The Iranians absolutely will refuse to have that conversation. So, I mean, that is a problem.
If I could just jump in on that one point about, this very problematic issue of dual nationals. I mean, it's part of a basket of consular issues that really could deal with more, much more attention at the international level. Plug for the Rideau Institute. We did publish a report by former head of consular affairs at Global Affairs for many years, and identified and identified a number, and of course that was one of them. And it's not an easy issue to deal with, but many countries face this problem. And it is something that it would be very worthwhile if a country like Canada would take that up, at the international level. This is dialogue at the UN, and there are fora and there are talks, but they're not really getting anywhere.
But I do have to say the Iranians are the country that I've had experience with that is most adamant about not crossing that threshold, about having discussions. But for example, when we've had Canadians, dual national Egyptian Canadians, when Mohammed Fahmy was, for example, in jail in Egypt. Now he had to do some things with his citizenship which were different, but we could at least, the Egyptians would engage us, and we could have that conversation with them. The Iranians would absolutely refuse to have that conversation with us. So there are different degrees.
But there are a number of countries in the same that behave like Iran as well. Quite a number.
Yeah.
So I've heard about this issue, and I understand it's very unfortunate, and you're basically saying that based on your experience. One of the things I think we need to just put in perspective is that sort of the relation of the Iranian government and at that time with the Harper government. That was a very important situation, because the Harper government, not just because of ending relations with Iran, but overall with all the different things that they did, the sanctions that Canada at that time had against Iran, it was above and beyond the sanctions of the United Nations Security Council. And as far as I remember, even in some aspects, we were Canada was more aggressive in compared to the United States and the European Union in some aspects. Not all. So that is an important point. From what I know and I hear from Iranian perspective as well, they were positive about Trudeau government, and they hope that they hope, and I think they still are hopeful that there would be opportunity for re-engagement, and that's why I think they were being more cooperative. For example, on the case of Dr. Homa Houtvar, or a couple of other situations that we have heard about, that they were trying to cooperate, hoping that re-engagement is going to happen, because the policy was to re-engage with Iran. So they were more cooperative. The Harper government, unfortunately at that time, there was no talk of re-engagement. They had embassy, but there was no sort of cooperation between two countries. So that's if we look at it from that perspective, maybe that's one of the reasons.
And just to jump in very quickly again, thank you. Just going back, I mean, to the question, just a very quick point on on how we engage on human rights, and just to note, perhaps the obvious, but consistency and avoiding double standards, helps. And so if we look at the Justice of Victims of Torture Act, 2 countries on that list, and when others clearly could also be on that list.
Terrorism,
if we
not
wanted
torture.
to.
It's terrorism,
Sorry,
not torture.
terrorism, not torture. Terrorism. Sorry, Victims of Terrorism Act. Yes, Victims of Terrorism Act. And of course the other aspect of that, yes, it is very problematic that it was an all-party agreement, but it's a good example